Hello dear chess friends, my name is Marko Makaj, I'm FIDE master from Croatia and I record this video for great chess teaching site Remote Chess Academy. The topic for our today video will be play with or against isolated pawn on d4. Here, in this particular position, I will try to explain you how to play with isolated pawn or how to play against it. It's important to understand that those kind of the structure can arise from many different kind of the openings. Here, for instance, I show you the position that arrived from the Sicilian defense, especially from the Alapin variation. After ninth move from white, which was c takes on d4, I will show you later the whole position or whole, let's say, move order, we get to this position. And now basically today's topic will be play with or without this d4 pawn, and mainly the structure that arrived will be very similar to this one. So first, let's see what happens from white perspective. White has here isolated pawn on d4. This means that potentially this pawn can be weak if black first will not allow white to push this pawn forward, because if in next positions white will get this chance by opening position, and if he sees the initiative after d5 without to lose this pawn, white will have the advantage, of course, and the initiative in the center. First thing that you need to know with white is that this pawn can be very weak or very strong. Everything depends about the minor pieces that will play around this pawn. For instance, here white has d4 pawn that mainly have great mean of e5 square, because e5 square will be very good outpost for white, especially for white knight from f3, in order to create some kind of the threats on the king side from black. That means that if white have isolated pawn, he will have slight more space in the center, because this pawn will somehow control vital square e5, also c5, and all white pieces can play around this pawn. Especially as we mean now, and we can tell that this e5 outpost will be great square for white knight. Very important is here to know that the side who will have this isolated pawn will have in most of the situation very concrete idea. And this is the attack on the opponent's king. Basically because white has slight more space and better develop of minor pieces in the center, he will have some kind of the potential to play on the king side. You can see that this light square bishop play on the king side and on the h7 square. The knight can potentially go to e5, and of course this queen can go on h5, g4, or even f3 later on. Also, what white has in this position is the opportunity to maneuver with his pieces all around the center, because black has very solid but not so active structure. Let's try to reverse the color now, and let's see what we can tell about black pieces. So, if we try to get reverse color here, we can see that now with black pieces we can try to play against this d4 isolated pawn. Now, as we mentioned before, black has here slight disadvantage in space, because his pawn structure ends on e6, which is nice to cover d5 square, but any other square in the center. That means that black first need to not allow this d4 pawn to go any further. When black stops this pawn to move forward on d5, then he can try even to attack him. Very important is to have the position where he can control even the e5 square. For instance, here after cd4, very useful move is knight to c6. Why? because this knight now cover e5 square and doesn't allow this knight to move forward on this very vital square. Of course, the second idea is to take advantage over d4 pawn and try to expose those weaknesses from white. Of course, white, because he has more space and better development for now, can easily defend even indirectly this pawn, because now black never can take on d4 immediately, because knight will take on d4, and after queen take on d4, bishop h7, white will win the queen and win this game in the next few moves. So let's go back here and let's say in few words what else black idea is here. Because black doesn't have any kind of the weaknesses in the pawn structure, he's slight behind in the development. And the only piece that you need to know where to, let's say, get into play is this slight square bishop. In most of the situation, this slight square bishop will not have great outpost in the center, or for instance here on any square on this diagonal, especially c8 to h3. So you need to be very careful when and how to develop this bishop. As in many other opening or any other positions that arrived after the opening, here for instance after 9 move, you need to develop first the knight. So after knight goes to c6, in most of the cases first rook d1 white will play, and after rook d8 or maybe a6 or maybe b6, black can try to develop this light square bishop. I think that here most probably the best possible way is first to play the move b6, and now after knight to c3 decided where do you want to put this queen. You have mainly two squares in the position like this. Here in this special position I believe you can put the queen on a5 or on h5, but because you play b6, probably the best possible way is to play queen to h5, because if you move the queen to a5, you will somehow be dislocated from this diagonal, and because of the pawn on b6, you will not be able to come back on d8 or on c7. Here on h5, black queen has slight more space. Now, I will try to go back and show you exactly the move order and how both of the sides wants to play in order to reach specific position. As I mentioned before, we can see this position in many openings and in many moves order, so it's very important to understand the fundamental ideas and let's say the examples how to proceed in those positions. For instance, after e4, c5, c3, black play d5. He wants to play in the center, he wants to show white that he doesn't have the position where he wants to defend himself, so he wants to open the position, take over maybe even the initiative, if white is not following the best possible way of play. After taking on d5, queen takes on d5, and d4, of course, the best possible way to try let's say somehow to take over the central squares in the board. Knight f6, knight f3 and e6. So black will now see when and how take on d4 in order to get this let's say exposed or somehow weak pawn on d4. Queen e2, c takes d and c takes d. And here you can see how easily you can get in this position from Sicilian defense Alapin variation. Now, in order to show you also few other examples, I prepare two more openings and two more lines that can bring to similar situation. Now, I will show you how we can go in this, or how we can get this position from the Caro-Kann move order. For instance, if white play e4, c6, d4, d5, e takes on d5 and c takes on d5, c4, e6. You can see some similarity with the position that we saw earlier, but somehow we will have slight different move order, because now in this Caro-Kann variation, pawn of attack, white wants to play knight to c3 and somehow still have some tension in the center, because in the line before, black is the side who takes on d4 first and then see how he will improve in the position. Here white get the tension in the center, and here white mainly is the side who dictates the tempo. So white will in some move take on d5. Knight f6, very important move order, because now you can see that white attacked this d5 pawn and black defended. Knight to f3, of course, bishop to e7, and now white, before he play bishop to d3 or bishop e2, first wants to take the pawn on d5. Why? Because if now black take with the pawn, then the pawn structure will be somehow similar, but white will have extra move, and it will not be the position that black will play for the advantage. With knight takes on d5, black somehow wants to play the position where maybe even he can try to play for this weak pawn on d4. And after knight takes on d5, sorry, let's suppose that white play bishop to d3 and castle on the king side, and castle on the king side will get us to the similar position as we saw earlier. In this position we have the knight on c3 and knight on d5, and the queen is on d8. So here the strategy is somehow different than in the position before, because now this knight on d5 is very nice piece, because he blocked the pawn on d4, but also this knight on d5 has one drawback, and this is the case that with knight on d5, black doesn't have such initiative against this d4 pawn, because this knight on d5 is in front of this pawn on d4. That means that here in this position, black needs to defend first, as we mentioned before, the square d5, in order to neutralize this pawn from moving forward. And then when he has the position, and when he will have the position in this particular way, where black will somehow just take very seriously this advance on d5 and doesn't allow white to push this pawn, then he will try to play the game, which will in the finish somehow even be related with taking this pawn on d4. So now, after knight d5, knight c6, we have the position where black is once again a little bit put over from the space and from the center. That means that white has also more space here and probably better piece development, because you can see that bishop from c8 is not yet in the game and he doesn't play any role here. And in this case, black has the problem with him and he needs to find the right way how to do this. Mainly, this diagonal, as we mentioned before, c8, h3, is not possible for black to develop this bishop. That means that he will, in many cases, if not in all cases, need to develop himself on b7 square. No matter if you push first a6 and then b5, or if you push first pawn to b6. In both of the cases, you will, with black, play bishop to b7. And then every single black piece will be developed. Black will have very solid but slight passive position. And in those kind of the position, black always wants to exchange few minor pieces. Why so? Because with the exchange of few minor pieces, black will have a lot more space for all other pieces, and also he will have more space and also possibility to attack this pawn on d4. In the position like this, one thing that is also very important is to know that a black play maybe against this weak, possibly weak, potentially weak d4 pawn, but in some cases black also play against somehow even maybe a weaker pawn on c3. For instance, what black can do here after, let's say, move like bishop to d2, I can take on c3, b takes on c3, I can develop the bishop on d7, and then I can get the rook to c8. It's only a matter of positional idea. I doesn't want to really to show you exact move order, and then after, let's say, queen to c2, I can play knight to a5. Now, why this is the idea for black? Okay, in this position first, of course, I don't want to get this pawn from h7, and that's why we will get in the position like this. Now, not only d4 or now, d4 pawn is not weak because the pawn, white other pawn is on c3. But now potentially black can seize the initiative over the c file because now c4 square is vital square for black pieces. Now you can see how the position can transpose from d4 and d5 squares to c4 and c3 squares. And now if black somehow managed to control this c4 square and then also bishop c6, bishop d5, all light squares, then he will stop the position or the play, active play from white, and he will have the advantage. If now I switch over the board and get in this specific position the white pieces, now you need to know how to play or what can you get with white pieces. Of course, here with white pieces, you want to control the e5 square, somehow bring the knight on e5, and then try to play on the king side. It's very easy to understand this because white here has all of the pieces related to the play, for the play on the king side. And then if white managed to attack black king, then he will have the initiative on the king side, or if black neutralizes white play on the king side, he will have potentially some kind of the advantage in the endgame. And now I want to show you the third main position that arrived in the Queen's Gambit, here accepted, where after e3, e6, bishop takes on c4, c5, castle, knight to c6, queen e2, c takes d, rook d1, bishop e7 and in d4, we get to very similar position from the first game, with one slight disadvantage for white, which is that his rook is now on d1 and queen on e2, but the black queen is not on d5, and white will not get this extra tempi for knight to c3. But nevertheless, here also white has great, let's say, attacking pawn on d4 because he somehow control e5 square and get white the option to play knight e5, and this pawn once again control more than a half of the board for white, which will be in the next couple of moves situation where white will have certain minor piece activity for this let's say potentially weak pawn on d4. And as in both of the lines before, one very important thing to see is that black light square bishop is still on c8 and he needs to be developed always, almost always, on b7 square. In some of the position you can develop him on d7 and on c6 also. Black idea is just to control first the d5 square and doesn't allow white to push d5, and after, when he somehow managed to defend this d5 square, he'll be able to in some kind of the endgames attack this potentially weak pawn. Very important is to understand once again that white will play for the attack on the king side because of the much more space in the center and because of the more active and mobile pieces there. Black idea is just to exchange few pieces and then play for a long run. This is related after it with somehow exposed, potentially exposed pawn on d4 or the pawn on c3 if he managed to exchange this knight on c3. Now, for the conclusion of our today's lesson, I can say that in this position, this weak or strong pawn on d4 support very vital square on e5, and this is the great outpost for white knight on f3. Whoever control the square d5 will dictate the center and will dictate the tempo in the center. That means if white managed to break with d5 pawn, he will see his very nice initiative in the center. If black doesn't allow this, then black will have great strategical idea by stopping this pawn to moving forward. And then very important also is to understand that beside of this pawn on d4, white can have also one other weaknesses, and this is the weak pawn potentially on c3. If in some lines black managed to exchange in most of the cases knight on c3, and white will take with b pawn on c3, this pawn will have the great impact on white's center, and he will somehow secure the d4 square, but potentially he can be weak later on.